On December 2nd, 1993, a man who had dominated Colombia for more than a decade lay dead on a rooftop in Medellín. He had celebrated his 44th birthday just one day earlier. Within minutes, photographs of his body spread across the world. The Medellín Cartel, the criminal empire he had built through violence, fear, and unimaginable wealth, collapsed with him. For millions, Pablo Escobar's death marked the end of one of the bloodiest chapters in modern Colombian history. But for three people, the nightmare was only beginning. You don't inherit your father's fortune when the world wants it gone. You inherit his enemies. Imagine waking up to discover that every bodyguard who once protected your family has disappeared. Every safe house has become target. Every telephone call could reveal your location. Every stranger might recognize your face from a newspaper. That was the new reality for María Victoria Henao, her teenage son Juan Pablo Escobar, and her young daughter Manuela only hours after Pablo Escobar was killed. The family had lived for years under constant danger, but they had always believed Pablo's power could keep them alive. That illusion vanished on a single December afternoon. And then, the threats began. Former allies disappeared. Former enemies stepped forward. According to documented accounts, rival organizations made it clear that remaining in Colombia was no longer an option. The Escobar name, once capable of opening any door with fear or money, had become a death sentence. There's a cruel irony here. Pablo Escobar had spent years building one of the most feared criminal empires in the world. Yet after his death, his own family struggled to find even one country willing to give them refuge. Their escape would become a desperate journey across continents. They searched for asylum wherever they could. Countries refused to accept them. Before his death, Escobar himself had attempted to send his family abroad, but efforts involving the United States and later Germany failed after intervention from Colombian authorities and the DEA. Even with all his money and influence, he could not secure a safe future for the people he claimed to love most. Eventually, after traveling through Mozambique and Brazil, the family would finally reach Argentina. But they would not arrive as the Escobars. They would arrive with new names, new identities, new lives built on silence. One family would spend decades trying to erase a surname recognized across the globe, while the world refused to forget it. And before they could disappear forever, they would first have to survive the dangerous days immediately following the fall of the Medellín Cartel. When Pablo Escobar died on December 2nd, 1993, the headlines celebrated the end of Colombia's most notorious drug lord. Television cameras focused on the rooftop in Medellín, where security forces posed beside his body. To the outside world, justice had finally caught up with a man whose empire had spread fear across the country. But if you had been standing beside his family that same day, you would have seen something entirely different. Their future had collapsed just as completely as his cartel. Within hours, María Victoria Henao realized that the fortune people imagined still existed could no longer protect her children. Money hidden in secret locations meant little if no country would let you enter its borders. Armed guards disappeared. Trusted associates vanished. The family suddenly found themselves alone, carrying one of the most recognizable surnames on earth. But their greatest danger did not come from the Colombian government. It came from the people who had survived Pablo Escobar. According to documented accounts, representatives connected to the Cali cartel, Escobar's greatest criminal rival, demanded that the family surrender a significant portion of their remaining assets. The exact value remains disputed by historians and biographers, but the central fact is consistently reported. Negotiations took place, and property was handed over in exchange for guarantees that the family would not be hunted down. It was a brutal transaction. The empire that had once accumulated unimaginable wealth was now paying simply for the chance to stay alive. There's another painful irony hidden in this moment. For years, Pablo Escobar had solved problems with money. Officials could be bribed, enemies could be bought, loyalty could be purchased. Yet after his death, his family discovered that money had become almost worthless. No amount of wealth could erase the Escobar name. Their options disappeared one after another. Even before Pablo's death, attempts to move the family abroad had failed. Plans involving the United States ended without success. A later attempt through Germany also collapsed after Colombian authorities and the DEA intervened. Every closed border sent the same message. No government wanted to become the refuge of Pablo Escobar's family. And then, the search for survival became a journey across continents. The family left Colombia and traveled through Mozambique and Brazil, desperately looking for a place where they could begin again. Eventually, Argentina agreed to receive them, but they arrived under entirely new identities, hoping anonymity would succeed where wealth had failed. They believed changing their names might finally allow them to escape the shadow of Pablo Escobar. They were about to discover that changing a name is far easier than escaping a legacy. Crossing a border should feel like reaching safety. For Pablo Escobar's family, every new border brought another rejection. You can imagine the uncertainty. Every airport terminal became a place of whispered conversations and suspicious glances. Immigration officers looked at passports. Governments looked at the surname behind them. The answer was almost always the same. No. Even before Escobar's death on December 2nd, 1993, he understood that Colombia was becoming too dangerous for his wife and children. Documented accounts show that he attempted to move them abroad while he was still alive. The plan seemed simple enough: leave the country before the violence reached them. Reality proved far harsher. The first attempts involving the United States failed. Another effort through Germany collapsed after Colombian authorities and the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration intervened. German officials refused to let the family remain and sent them back. The Escobar name had become more powerful than any passport they carried. But returning to Colombia was no longer a realistic option. With Pablo gone, his enemies were still alive, organized, and waiting. According to documented sources, Maria Victoria Henao understood that every additional day inside Colombia increased the danger for her children. The family continued searching for any country willing to receive them. Their journey eventually took them through Mozambique and Brazil. These were not glamorous destinations chosen for comfort. They were desperate stops in a search for survival. Every move carried uncertainty. Every flight could end with another refusal. Every government had to decide whether accepting Pablo Escobar's family was worth the political and security risks. There's a painful contradiction in this chapter. The world knew Pablo Escobar as one of history's wealthiest criminals. Newspapers had spent years describing his fortune. Yet after his death, his widow and children discovered that money could not purchase the one thing they needed most: a place where nobody wanted to kill them. Finally, Argentina agreed to receive them. The decision offered hope, but it came with a price. The Escobars had to disappear. Maria Victoria Henao adopted the new identity Maria Isabel Santos Caballero. Her son, once known as Juan Pablo Escobar, would eventually become Sebastián Marroquín. Their new names were more than legal documents. They were shields against recognition, revenge, and a past that refused to stay buried. Yet changing identities could never erase memories. Every conversation required caution. Every friendship carried risk. Every unexpected question about their past threatened to expose the truth. The family had escaped Colombia. Now they faced an even harder challenge: learning how to live without ever revealing who they really were. Arriving in Argentina should have marked the end of the family's ordeal. Instead, it became the beginning of a different kind of prison. You no longer wake up to the sound of gunfire or bodyguards shouting into radios. You walk ordinary streets. You buy groceries. You stand in line at a bank. Yet every ordinary moment carries one terrifying question. What happens if someone recognizes you? To survive, the family abandoned the identity that had defined their lives. María Victoria Henao Vécame María Isabel Santos Caballero. Her son, once introduced to the world as Juan Pablo Escobar, eventually adopted the name Sebastián Marroquín. On paper, Pablo Escobar's family had disappeared, but paper cannot erase history. The surname changed, yet memories remained untouched. Every new acquaintance represented a risk. Every request for identification created anxiety. They were no longer hiding from police raids or rival cartels. They were hiding from recognition itself. For young Sebastian, the burden was especially heavy. He had inherited neither his father's empire nor his fortune. Instead, he inherited one of the most infamous names in modern history. While other young men planned careers without looking over their shoulders, he had to build an entirely new identity from the ground up. He chose architecture. It was a profession that created buildings instead of destroying lives. There is a quiet symbolism in that decision. His father had become known for leaving cities scarred by violence. The son chose a career dedicated to designing places where people could live peacefully. His sister, Manuela, reacted differently. Rather than confronting the family's past, she withdrew from it almost completely. According to documented accounts, after arriving in Argentina, she disappeared from public life and spent decades avoiding interviews, television appearances, and public attention. While the world remained fascinated by the Escobar story, she chose silence as her only protection. There's another cruel irony here. Millions of people wanted to know everything about Pablo Escobar's children. Yet the one thing they wanted most, to live anonymously, was almost impossible to achieve. Years passed. The children grew into adults. The headlines became less frequent, but the legacy remained. Every documentary, every newspaper article, every new television series revived the surname they had tried so hard to leave behind. No legal document could separate them from a history written long before they were old enough to make their own choices. And then, after years of silence, Sebastián Marroquín made a decision that surprised the entire world. Instead of running from his father's past any longer, he chose to face it directly. For years, Sebastián Marroquín believed the safest way to survive was to remain invisible. He studied architecture, built a professional career, and tried to create a life unrelated to the man the world knew as Pablo Escobar. Yet every time a new documentary appeared, every time another book was published or another television series turned his father into a legend, the past returned. Silence was protecting his privacy, but it was also allowing others to tell his family story. Then came a decision that changed everything. In 2009, Sebastián stepped into the public eye with the documentary Sins of My Father. It was not a film defending Pablo Escobar or celebrating his empire. Instead, it became something few people expected from the son of the world's most infamous drug lord: an apology. The documentary followed Sebastián as he met with the children of people whose lives had been permanently altered by his father's actions. These meetings were not courtroom hearings or political negotiations. They were deeply personal conversations between people connected by a tragedy none of them had chosen. But an apology cannot rewrite history. No documentary could return lost parents. No conversation could erase decades of violence that had scarred Colombia. Sebastián understood that. His goal was different. Rather than asking for forgiveness, he acknowledged that the suffering caused by Pablo Escobar continued long after December 2nd, 1993. His father's death had ended the Medellín Cartel, but it had not ended the pain. 5 years later, in 2014, he expanded that conversation by publishing Pablo Escobar, My Father. The book offered a personal account of growing up inside one of the most dangerous families in modern history and described the uncertainty that followed his father's death. Instead of presenting Pablo Escobar as an untouchable legend, Sebastián portrayed him as a deeply flawed man whose decisions destroyed countless lives, including those closest to him. There is a powerful irony in this transformation. The son who had spent years hiding his identity now chose to reveal it to the entire world, not to preserve his father's reputation, but to challenge it. Sebastián repeatedly stated that Pablo Escobar should never be considered a role model. He described his father's path as one leading to self-destruction and the loss of fundamental human values. Those words carried unusual weight because they came from the person who had known Escobar not as a criminal icon, but simply as a father. Yet while Sebastián began speaking publicly, another member of the family made the opposite choice. His sister, Manuela, remained almost completely silent, refusing to step into the spotlight that continued to follow the Escobar name. If Sebastián Marroquín tried to confront the past, Manuela Escobar chose the opposite path. She disappeared, not in the dramatic way people expect from the daughter of Pablo Escobar, but quietly, almost completely. After the family settled in Argentina under new identities, Manuela withdrew from public life. While journalists searched for interviews and television producers offered opportunities to tell her story, she refused to become part of the public conversation. According to documented accounts, she has spent decades avoiding interviews and public appearances, protecting a privacy that had been impossible during her childhood. But silence can be its own burden. Imagine carrying one of the most recognizable family names in modern history while pretending to be someone else. Every school, every workplace, every new friendship carried a hidden risk. The truth could emerge from an old photograph, a newspaper article, or a casual conversation. Even after changing her identity, Manuela could never be certain that the past would stay buried. Her brother made peace with public attention by speaking openly about their father. Manuela chose another form of survival. She simply stepped away. There is a painful contrast between the two siblings. One believed healing required telling the story. The other believed healing required never telling it again. Neither choice erased what had happened on December 2nd, 1993. Meanwhile, their mother continued living under the name Maria Isabel Santos Caballero, the identity she adopted after leaving Colombia. For her, the new name represented more than legal protection. It marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. The woman who had once lived beside one of the world's most feared criminals now tried to exist as an ordinary citizen, far from Medellin and far from the violence that had defined her past. Yet ordinary life remained difficult. Every documentary about Pablo Escobar brought renewed media attention. Every anniversary of his death reminded the public that his family was still alive somewhere. The Escobar name had become part of global popular culture, and each new film or television series reopened wounds the family had spent years trying to close. Here lies another bitter irony. Millions knew Pablo Escobar without ever meeting him. At the same time, almost nobody truly knew the people who had lived beside him every day. His wife and children became famous because of a man whose legacy they could neither celebrate nor completely escape. For Sebastián, speaking became a way forward. For Manuela, silence became a permanent refuge. Yet both paths led to the same destination, a lifetime spent living under the shadow of a man who had died decades earlier, while Colombia itself struggled with the question of how that shadow should be remembered. Leaving Colombia did not mean the Escobar family was finally free. It only meant the battlefield had changed. The streets of Medellín were replaced by unfamiliar cities. Armed confrontations were replaced by fear of discovery. The family no longer lived inside the world Pablo Escobar had controlled, but they still carried the consequences of everything he had built. For Maria Victoria Henao and her children, exile was not simply a change of location. It was a permanent state of uncertainty. The greatest danger was no longer knowing who wanted revenge. It was knowing that someone might. After Pablo Escobar's death, the Medellín Cartel disappeared as a dominant force, but the conflict surrounding his empire did not disappear overnight. Rival groups, former enemies, and people who had suffered because of the cartel still remembered the Escobar name. According to documented accounts, representatives connected to the Cali cartel pressured the family to surrender assets as part of negotiations for their safety. The exact amount of money involved remains disputed, but the message was clear. The empire was gone. The family was vulnerable. There is a cruel reversal in their story. During Pablo Escobar's lifetime, thousands of people feared his decisions. Politicians, police officers, and rivals understood the danger of confronting him. Yet after his death, his own wife and children were the ones forced to negotiate for survival. The protection had disappeared. The fear had changed direction. And then, Argentina became the place where the family attempted to rebuild. But rebuilding required a sacrifice almost impossible for anyone connected to Pablo Escobar. They had to hide themselves. Sebastián Marroquín later explained through interviews and his writings that growing up after his father's death meant carrying a responsibility he never chose. He had to decide whether he would allow the Escobar name to define him forever or whether he would create a completely different identity. His answer was to reject the path of violence. Instead of becoming involved in criminal activity, he studied architecture and created a career far removed from his father's world. He chose to design structures rather than participate in destruction. Yet even professional success could not fully separate him from the past. A simple introduction could become complicated. A stranger recognizing his face could reopen old fears. A question about his father could transform an ordinary conversation into a reminder of the life he had escaped. Meanwhile, Manuela continued choosing silence. Unlike her brother, she did not attempt to explain the family's history to the public. She remained away from cameras and interviews, protecting the private life she had built in Argentina. But the Escobar story refused to disappear. Every new documentary, every book, every anniversary of Pablo's death brought the same name back into headlines. The family had escaped the cartel, but they had never escaped its shadow. The fall of Pablo Escobar was not only the collapse of one criminal organization, it was the end of an era that had changed Colombia forever. For more than a decade, the Medellín cartel had transformed the country's reality. Violence reached government buildings, newspapers, streets, and homes. The conflict between drug organizations and the state created thousands of victims and left a generation marked by fear. When Escobar died on December 2nd, 1993, Colombia did not suddenly become peaceful. The most visible enemy was gone, but the consequences remained. The disappearance of the Medellín cartel created a power vacuum. Other criminal organizations competed for control of the drug trade, while Colombia continued fighting against groups involved in narcotics, armed conflict, and illegal economies. The country had removed one powerful figure, but the problems that allowed his empire to rise did not disappear overnight. And then, The story of the Escobar family became part of a much larger question. What happens after an empire falls? Throughout history, families connected to powerful figures often discover that the collapse of power affects generations. The children of kings inherit fallen kingdoms. The descendants of dictators inherit ruined names. The families of criminals inherit a different kind of burden, the judgment of millions of strangers. Sebastián Marroquín's life became an example of this struggle. He was not responsible for his father's crimes. He was a child when Pablo Escobar built the height of his empire. Yet the world connected him to actions he did not commit. His challenge was not only creating a new career or a new identity. His challenge was convincing people that a surname does not determine a person's choices. By speaking publicly, creating the documentary Sins of My Father in 2009, and publishing Pablo Escobar, My Father in 2014, Sebastián attempted to separate himself from the legend surrounding his father. He did not try to preserve the image of Pablo Escobar as a powerful figure. Instead, he focused on the destruction caused by that power. There is a painful lesson in his journey. The same name that once opened doors through fear eventually closed doors through suspicion. The Escobar family had once lived surrounded by wealth, protection, and influence. After the cartel collapsed, they lived surrounded by questions. Who are you really? Can you escape the actions of someone who came before you? Can a person rebuild after inheriting a legacy they never requested? Meanwhile, Colombia itself continued changing. The city of Medellín, once internationally associated with Escobar's violence, worked for decades to redefine its image. In 2018, authorities demolished the famous Monaco building, one of Escobar's former properties, replacing it with a memorial project dedicated to victims of the drug war. The message was clear. The future would not be built around glorifying the past. But even as cities changed and buildings disappeared, one thing remained impossible to destroy: memory. Because the final battle for Pablo Escobar's family was never about money or territory. It was about whether they could create a future beyond a name that the entire world already knew. Decades passed after Pablo Escobar's death, but the story of his family never truly ended. The cartel was gone. The empire was gone. The mansion, the guards, the hidden power, all of it had disappeared. What remained were three people trying to answer one impossible question. How do you build a normal life after being born into an extraordinary past? For Sebastián Marroquín, the answer was reinvention. Born Juan Pablo Escobar, he spent his childhood surrounded by a reality most people could never imagine. His father was one of the most feared criminals in the world. Yet to him, Pablo Escobar was also simply his father. After escaping Colombia and creating a new identity in Argentina, Sebastián chose a completely different path. He became an architect. Instead of controlling territories, he designed spaces. Instead of using fear to gain influence, he used his own story to speak about the consequences of violence. His transformation became one of the most unusual examples of a child of a notorious figure trying to separate himself from inherited reputation. But the past continued following him. Every interview brought questions about Pablo Escobar. Every public appearance reopened the same discussion. The world was interested not only in Sebastián's own achievements, but in his connection to the man whose name had become globally recognized. Still, he continued speaking. Through Sins of My Father in 2009 and his book Pablo Escobar, My Father in 2014, Sebastián attempted to show another side of the story. Not a celebration of wealth or power, but a warning about where violence eventually leads. His message was simple. A person should not be judged only by the crimes of someone who came before them. At the same time, his mother, María Victoria Henao, continued living under the identity Maria Isabel Santos Caballero. Unlike her son, she avoided public attention for years. Her goal was not to explain the past, but to survive beyond it. After leaving Colombia, anonymity became her protection. For Manuela, the youngest member of the family, the distance from the public was even greater. While Sebastián became the voice of the family story, Manuela chose not to participate in that story publicly. According to available reports, she continued avoiding interviews and public appearances, maintaining a private existence away from the attention surrounding her father's name. There is a final irony in their journey. Pablo Escobar spent years trying to become impossible to ignore. He wanted the world to know his power. His family spent decades trying to become invisible. The father built a name that reached every corner of the planet. The children spent their lives trying to escape that same name. And yet, despite everything, the Escobar family remained connected to a history that Colombia and the world refused to forget. Their survival was not measured by wealth or influence anymore. It was measured by something much simpler: the ability to wake up each morning and live as ordinary people. But even after decades had passed, one question remained unanswered. Could the children of one of history's most infamous men ever truly separate themselves from his legacy? More than 3 decades have passed since the final moments of Pablo Escobar on that Medellín rooftop. The gunshots ended. The Medellín Cartel disappeared. The buildings connected to his empire were demolished or transformed. But one thing survived longer than the money, the weapons, and the power: the name. Today, the Escobar family exists far away from the world that created their story. They no longer live as the family of a cartel leader surrounded by guards and fear. They live as people who spent decades trying to separate themselves from a past they never created. Sebastián Marroquín continues to live in Argentina, where he built a career as an architect and became an author and public speaker. Instead of hiding forever, he chose to confront the history attached to his family. Through his documentary, Sins of My Father in 2009, and his book Pablo Escobar, My Father in 2014, he attempted to show the human consequences behind his father's decisions. His message was not that the past should be forgotten. It was that the past should be understood. But understanding is not the same as forgiveness. The victims of Pablo Escobar's violence cannot be separated from this story. Thousands of families in Colombia experienced loss, fear, and suffering during the years when the Medellín Cartel fought against the government and rival organizations. The story of Escobar's family is only one part of a much larger tragedy. Meanwhile, Manuela Escobar has continued to maintain a private life away from the public eye. Unlike her brother, she did not become a writer or documentary participant. She chose silence, avoiding interviews and attention connected to her father's legacy. Their mother, María Victoria Henao, also continued living under the identity María Isabel Santos Caballero, the name she adopted after leaving Colombia. For her, survival meant rebuilding a life where the world did not constantly recognize her connection to Pablo Escobar. There is a final irony in this story. Pablo Escobar spent years trying to make his name unforgettable, and he succeeded. But his children spent their lives trying to prove that a name does not have to control a person's future. That is the true tragedy of the Escobar family. A child can inherit a surname. A child can inherit memories. A child can inherit the consequences of another person's choices. But a child cannot inherit responsibility for actions they never committed. The fall of the Medellín Cartel was not only the story of a criminal empire collapsing. It was the story of what happens afterward, when the world moves on, but the people connected to history must continue living with it. Because every fallen empire leaves behind survivors. Some lose their wealth, some lose their homes, some lose their identity, and some spend their entire lives trying to answer one question. Can you ever truly escape the shadow of someone who changed the world before you were old enough to understand it? The story of Pablo Escobar's family reminds us that power is temporary, but consequences can last for generations. If you want to discover more forgotten stories of fallen empires, lost dynasties, and the people who survived their collapse, subscribe and join us as we uncover the human side of history. But tell us, should the children of powerful figures be judged by the actions of their parents, or should every person have the chance to create their own legacy?